crisis that put the world in peril. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The compromise that saved the world.
Actually, it could be called the October Crisis, or the Caribbean Crisis. The crisis name depends on the location of the country involved. For most Americans, this event is called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The majority of Russians call it the Caribbean Crisis. Most Cubans call the incident the October Crisis. This is because the Cubans have been subjected to so many other crises in every other month. This makes sense for Cubans because they have also experienced the January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, November, and December crisis.
From October 16th to October 28th, 1962, the conflict of the Cuban Missile Crisis changed the world we live in today, endangered millions of lives across the globe. The Soviet Union, placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, forced the nation to protect its citizens and compromise. The Cuban Missile Crisis impacted the relationship between the two nation superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, as well as Cuba, and still does today.
After the Cuban Revolution, with Cuba's leader, the corrupt Fidel Castro, the United States invaded Cuba with the CIA-supported Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed. The invasion was made by the United States in 1961, after Cuba, a formerly United States ally, started to have relations with the Soviet Union. The Soviets also used to be allies of the United States in World War II, but their relations dissipated.
Cuba agreed to the Soviet Union's offer of deploying nuclear missiles into the country in case of invasion. Here, the missiles could reach the United States in minutes, with it being only 130 miles away from the closest Florida at its closest points, very similar to the Jupiter missiles that the United States placed in Turkey and Italy in case of Soviet invasion. The missiles were secretly shipped to Cuba, and the missiles were operational. The Soviet Union presumed that the United States would do nothing to stop the USSR from placing ballistic missiles in Cuba. However, in July 1962, U.S. intelligence surveillance discovered the missile sites located in Cuba from photographs taken from a U-2 aircraft spy plane.
The photographs showed medium and intermediate range ballistic nuclear missiles. The missiles could reach the majority of the United States with its long-range missiles, while the medium-range missiles could reach several states. Taking action, John F. Kennedy and the others had a meeting on October 16, 1962, after they were informed by the CIA the next morning after the photographs were taken.
Military advisors urged an invasion on Cuba, but Kennedy decided another approach. As an invasion would start a nuclear war, Kennedy told his allies what the situation was. And on October 22, 1962, John F. Kennedy issued a public warning. He had decided and announced that they would order a naval blockade against Cuba in order to prevent further shipments of the nuclear missiles. All shipments of offensive weapons and associated material to Cuba would be intercepted by the U.S. Navy during the quarantine.
The United States did not consider the USSR as a equal power, and the Soviets reacted. Essentially, the whole crisis in the Cold War was based on the Soviet Union trying to be the more dominant nation.
The quarantine of 56 U.S. warships enforced the blockade, and Kennedy told everyone, aiming the message at Khrushchev and the Soviets, that if they were not removed, further actions would be taken. Now, the United States were on DEFCON 3 alert, on the Defense Readiness System. The closer to DEFCON 1, the closer to being prepared for something disastrous for the United States of America.
The two nations were getting closer and closer to a nuclear war. The two leaders of the nations started to communicate, sending messages to each other. Furious with the naval blockade, Nikita Khrushchev sent a letter to John F. Kennedy. In the letter, one of the passages he wrote states, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind to the abyss of world nuclear missile war." It seemed like there would be a compromise, however, it was still unclear.
Then on October 26, 1962, a Soviet spy talked to John A. Scaly of ABC News about a possible compromise. The Soviets would remove the nuclear missiles in Cuba under UN surveillance if the United States agreed to leave Cuba alone. After this incident came the most intense 6 days of the entire Cold War. John F. Kennedy sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev asking to remove the missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev insisted that they were only a counteract to the missiles in Italy and Turkey, and only defensive.
With the armed weapons still in Cuba, the United States were indeed ready for an invasion if needed. On October 27, 1962, which is known as Black Saturday, Nikita Khrushchev, on a broadcast, suggested a new deal. He said that the United States should remove the missiles located in Italy and Turkey. The missiles were pretty much useless, and they were already going to remove the missiles.
Later that day, Major Rudolph Anderson was piloting an U-2 spy plane, surveying the progression of the missiles, and suddenly he was shot down out of the sky by Soviet missiles located in Cuba, along with his plane. However, neither the United States or the Soviet Union chose to bring this up and heighten this conflict. Then, a nuclear-filled USSR submarine was hit. It was only a small depth charge for the U.S. Navy, signaling the submarine to come up. The commanders on the submarine were too deep into the water to communicate with the surface, and they thought war had begun. They prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo.
The decision of the launch had to be made by 3 Soviet Union officers on the submarine. The political officer as well as the captain both authorized the launch, but the second in command, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to launch it.
As a result, the nuclear torpedo was not launched, preventing a false alarm turned into a nuclear war, also saving the U.S. Navy ship and its fleet.
But the crisis was indeed far from being over. For the first time in United States history, the U.S. military called a DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one level away from the brink of world nuclear missile war. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met up with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin.
The two men were trying to create a compromise to finally resolve the war that could have ended the entire world. If there was a communication error, or something didn't go right, or the way a country planned, the conflict will escalate into a nuclear war.
The two representatives came across a deal. The United States would have to remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy that they had kept there all along. They would also have to leave Cuba alone and not harm them as part of the compromise. The Soviet Union would have to take back the nuclear missiles from Cuba as their part of the deal.
The Cuban Missile Crisis has left a large mark on the world by raising awareness on nuclear conflicts. Former U.S. Senator and NTI co-chairman who was alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis and experienced it firsthand, Sam Nunn, said, "If I ever had the chance to try to do something to reduce nuclear dangers, I would. Because I felt mankind was really at stake then, the future of mankind." Another woman who was alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis said,
"Well, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was afraid that we were going to be attacked by Russia, seeing how he had nuclear weapons so close to our country. I guess for a kid, or for even anybody, that's a frightening thing to think about, that, the world as you know it, or the country as you know it, could be destroyed."
And since then, the number of nuclear missiles the United States has decreased by over 21,000 missiles, showing the United States learning from its past mistakes and allowing other people and countries to learn from this conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis left a long-term positive impact on the world, showing how close the world got to a nuclear disaster. This 13-day crisis will always be remembered throughout history as a historical event that largely impacted the world we live in today.